Hi everyone, Simon from Horoma Studio. Today I wanted to do a teardown for a project of the library I did work on a couple of years ago. The project went okay, but still there were like a couple of things I wasn't really happy with. Like the overall images were not very good basically. The project, and that is one of the always frustrating things, is that the project was very interesting. There was like a lot of very interesting material to deal with. And I think I didn't do a good job at like selling the best point of view. So we went for stuff that I think were not exactly suiting the project. So I wanted to share that with you and have a look at the project and sort of like share as much as I can so that you can potentially find any value in there. So let's get started. So the project is this library, as I was saying, a very nice project, very simple volumetry of like very small details that are very interesting, consisting of this very interesting chartwood that is very specific material that kind of requires specific lighting and quite a bit of experience in order to make it look nice, which I don't think I had at the time, unfortunately. And there was like this very interesting contrast with a more light and natural wood looking here. Otherwise, we had this very cool plaza in the front, a bit of vegetation, and basically some people and etc. that was supposed to be gathering here. There was an interior shot, the entrance shot first. That was this guy. Very simple frontal shot of the entrance that was supposed to show kind of like the transparency and how it will enter, etc. The context, etc. Not very convincing shot, to be honest, but we'll discuss that a little bit later. And there was this interior shot of like this area with a sort of like display jewelry for an exhibition, and then it was just like kids and grown-ups or teenagers looking at stuff, because this is like a library basically. So very like the interior space was very qualitative. The problem is that I think we went for not the right point of view, because it was not a good option, and it made it. The problem is that there were things that were very hard to read in terms of space, and especially I think there's always this tendency, or not tendency, but things to keep in mind is that sometimes, or most of the time, people that will look at the image are not architects, and they're not like photographers. They're not people that really experience space in a like, let's say, advanced way. So it means that your image has to be as clear as possible. And here there was a lot of small elements that would make the project hard to understand. And I think I didn't do a good job at explaining why this was not the best point of view. Even though it can work, it was still like we had other options that would have worked better. So let's have a look actually at the other options that we sort of discussed with the client, and so that you can see a little bit the research process. Here was a very simple framing. One thing you can notice already is the frame, like the actual ratio of your frame, that's changed from this ratio to a very extended one. This was not due to the project requirements, in the sense that I think this ratio would have worked better with the volumetry of the project, but to the panel layout that they had, where they were actually, I think there was horizontal A0 and it was like a huge stripe. So something that is actually very uncomfortable to work with most of the time, especially for interior renderings, except if really the volumetry works with that. So this point of view was actually, I think, one of my favorite, because it was very simple at conveying the overall shape. You would understand, because there was like small tilted edges here, and you wouldn't really recognize them if you were starting to look from different angles. So very simple and understandable different types of planes on the the plaza here. So this is something I was kind of advocating for, but we didn't go for this image for some reason. This is kind of what we went for. The thing is, like, this version is okay. What we did do though is that since we extended it here, we started having the part of the project that was coming back or going back. And this is a problem in the sense that it sort of completely shifts the sort of like balance of the image by having something going that direction around that edge, instead of having something more centered around the whole project basically. This is a sort of tension I was not really happy to work with, but I kind of had to anyway. Here are some interior shots that I think were working quite nicely, because here you can see we have this sort of very nice double height that is very hard to read in the final image. Here we have, another option that was kind of okay-ish. This one was nice, kind of related to the other one that we ended up with, but we were reading much better the very interesting sort of like skylight or whatever, like very high glazing here area that would be interesting in order to read, because here we were kind of in the center and we would have had like low elements on the left, low elements on the right, we would still read the entrance, etc. So it was kind of a missed opportunity, I think. Here, this is kind of what we ended up with, even though we went a little bit on the right because they really wanted to be centered around that element. This one was very interesting as well, and I think was much easier to read in a transversal way, because then the beams were easier to understand, because once you look the other way up, they all overlap and it starts to be a little bit harder to read, especially since there's a lot of wood like literally everywhere. So it was a little bit harder to actually work the other way. Here's a shot for the entrance that I think was more interesting, because one thing it was doing is that it was sort of creating a sort of relationship between this part of the plaza here, and the entrance, whereas what we ended up with was something more centered around the entrance and around the transparency. And what it did is that it sort of completely isolated the project, which is not something you want to do, even though the plaza was not something that was supposed to be designed, but still, it was, I think, in my opinion, quite important to show how it would work with the plaza. Here it's interesting because even though the shot is made, like, would still need quite a lot of refining, it was still fun because you can see that you can have something very dynamic for something that is actually extremely static in terms of architecture. By emphasizing these sort of very interesting angles that you have here, you could have something very, as I said, like dynamic, and have something very fun to play with. But since we were more into this idea of transparency, that I think was not really relevant, to be honest, because there was this idea of like, I personally like this idea of, if you see something in one image, you don't need to see it in all images. And here there was this idea of like we're here and the interior image is just literally 20 meters further, and this was like very redundant in my opinion, and a missed opportunity to convey more information. So that's why I wasn't really satisfied with the overall point of views that we chose, unfortunately. Here is another one that we kind of ended up with. Here we had to deal a lot with the context that was not really interesting, and the interesting context that we were here, even though we were to define it, was a little bit cropped, so it wasn't not the best option. Here was like other options of frontal views, but more looking at the left part, but still cropping part of the thing and playing with different amounts of foreground. So very simple and quite nice. And here's basically the opposite view that we were like from here. Here we're like from the other angle, still cutting here and sort of emphasizing the project and the relationship with the plaza, sorry. The thing is that I think we didn't really know what was going to happen on this side, so not the most interesting point of view. Although I think we had a better understanding of the volumetry, because we had like the cast shadows that we could potentially have here wouldn't help in understanding the actual shape of this thing. Whereas on the final one, it was a bit harder to understand, I think. Anyway, this was for the sort of research. Let's have a look at the, at the exterior view of the project. So this one is actually fun because it ends up being, I think I like it better than the final one for some reason. Even though there are like many things that I don't like and that don't work, there are like a couple of things that work better, namely the ratio I think works better, because you can compare between these two, that suddenly we're losing a lot of negative space here that is actually required in order for this to not be too overwhelming, because this is, here especially for some reason, the black was very, very dark, but this makes the building look very heavy. Whereas if you look at this image, it actually looks much lighter. It is lighter in terms of colors, but it is lighter, and also because we have more negative space here. And this also, I would have done it in a different type of overcast weather. One thing that I struggled with quite a lot, to be honest, is the lighting of the project. And this is because for some reason, I knew that this type of chartwood would look very nice with an overcast weather, but for some reason, the tests that I did always looked a bit weird. And in retrospect, when I look at it now, I sort of understand better why it didn't work. The main reason why it didn't work and why the overcast option would have been a very good option. Why this sort of small overcast or like attempt at overcast weather doesn't work is because of this sort of warm look that we have from still like having actual direct light. This is something I thought would be interesting to keep in order to have a little bit of warmth, but it was actually not the right way to go. And the next and big thing that is not happening with this scenario, but that should be happening with overcast weather, is that normally your vegetation in an overcast weather is extremely saturated and bright. Like, it's pretty amazing. I don't know, like if you ever go to a forest or whatever with an overcast weather and see it from the outside, it's extremely bright and the greens are very specific to that weather. And they have nothing to do with what they would look like in direct sunlight. And the thing is here, the problem is that we don't have this saturation contrast between the vegetation and the dark chartwood here. So I think this is the main problem with this image. Here we still don't have it. And instead of having something very bright in the vegetation, we have something that is very dark as well. The point of view, as I was saying, is not ideal, but still the main problem comes from the lighting and the colors. We could still, in terms of framing, make it work by placing properly people, etc. Here, in my opinion, there are like way too many people and they're not properly integrated, so it makes it even worse. But there were a way, like an option that would make it work. Here, for instance, you can see that I was struggling and that I started working with potentially a different type of light with something a little bit bluer. And the problem, and this is actually, I don't even know why I didn't notice it, and I don't even know why it rendered that way, but all my vegetation is still retaining a very dark look. And I think maybe it would have popped in my mind a little bit better if for some reason it rendered brighter than this, but it didn't. So, too bad. One thing also, and I'll finish on this image with this comment, is basically why overcast would have been the way is for several reasons. The first one is that it would create, having this overcast sky would be very fun because it has low detail in the sense, or low density of detail, in the sense that you have like a lot of details happening here, a lot of density of information. So you need something in order, like you need your eye to be able to rest somewhere. That was the problem with the framing that we had, is that we reduced that area of place to rest. So this was already pretty bad. And also you can see I still retain some clouds, etc., which I think should have been completely erased for something very light and subtle in terms of overcast weather. The other reason why overcast weather would have been very nice is, as I was saying, for the vegetation. The vegetation should have looked way brighter and way more saturated than it did now. One thing also is that maybe the framing was not ideal because we can't really emphasize such small patches of vegetation, but still it should have been quite possible and it could have looked pretty nice. It would still have been quite nice to have maybe a little bit of maybe if here this was like a vegetation again, or if this sort of patch here was going all the way to here, so that we have something happening and have a little bit more weight in terms of colors. One thing also that would be created from that is that we would have a very interesting saturation contrast between this very low saturation chartwood and the high saturated vegetation. And the one last thing that is very nice in terms of overcast is that it helps in keeping a very like neutral middle of the day scenario with like people walking around, etc., and also in incorporating artificial light inside your building, because it is still darker or like too dark inside for it to be without artificial light. And what it would have created is that you could have a very neutral and green outside. It would then have this sort of much more inviting warmth inside the building, and then you would have this sort of more neutral look of the sky and the charred. So once, like, it's not a strict rule, but usually when you need daytime rendering with the necessity of transparency or an artificial light inside in order to read the inside, it's a good way to go with overcast weather, because it realistically show that scenario, and it really emphasizes the inside of the building by making it look much warmer than the outside, so it makes the building look more inviting. So that would be it for this point of view. If we look at the entrance, I really will go quickly on this one. I think the main problem is something that I don't like is this, when you have like very basic asphalt in the foreground, it's never really interesting. It looks like you're looking from outside of the world, basically. And also, even though we had this very interesting shape, I think it was like something was a bit too flat. I think maybe I should have gone with like a much harsher light here in that case, so that we have like a stronger contrast between maybe like a typical nice blue sky, the sort of light wood here, and very sharp and strong cast shadows. And that way maybe it would have been a bit more interesting. Also here, the problem is that we sort of insisted on having this transparency that I think was not required in any way, and that is like way too subtle for it to be very meaningful. And the thing is that suddenly it makes everything a bit flat, because this is the same value as this one, and we lose the sort of not transparency, but reflection that could be quite interesting to have. And also, again, if I had like a much harsher sunlight, I would have had like interesting highlights and a much like more interesting and less dull looking. This is like very dark for no reason. So I really don't know why I didn't investigate more the vegetation, because this was definitely the big problem in this image, or in this set of images actually. And for the inside one, as I was saying, there was just look at the first one, second one. Yep. Yeah, we had to add, you can see already that is a bit problematic, is that we had to add all this part here that we didn't have at first. Here you can see it looked way more open. So here we have we start to have quite a lot of stuff happening in the middle. And in the end, we have this very complicated image to understand, because it's packed with information. And while also for some reason my floor was not the most good looking, maybe it could have been like a little bit reflecting more interestingly. One thing, as I was saying, is that the fact that we're looking toward, or like perpendicular to the beams of the project, it makes it very, like, this whole area here is very hard to understand for someone who already knows the project, but for someone who doesn't, it's something that is almost non-legible. And the problem is that this happened as well here, where we don't even understand actually that there's a skylight and like a sort of atrium here happening that sort of brings light again. So there was something with the point of view that was not ideal. I think staying in the middle here would have like way more strength, because it was like a better like axis to play around. And also most probably, I think, being like actually parallel to the beams, it would have really emphasized this very nice double height here. And here the fact that we have the double height, but we don't read any sky, basically, any windows. We just see that there's light coming, but we really don't really understand exactly how it's working. So this is kind of a shame. And for some reason, you can see that there's like a contrast in the overall image that makes the people be extremely dark. And I don't know why it ended up that way, but it's something that was not very good. So, but beside that, I think like most of the texturing and the detailing was okay. It's just very not small details, but like some big direction that we took at the beginning that we're not gonna cut it, I think. So that would be the main thing. For fun, I did a little couple of extra images that I can show you here that can maybe sort of convey a little bit better. Here I went for this overcast and simple mood, and for some reason you can see that having this softer light, having this more open part, we can suddenly have a better understanding and better perception of space. And also having like a simpler lighting, we have like a better emphasis of this part bringing light. So, and this one was just supposed to be like a very simple close-up. I didn't go through the hassle actually of doing like a main interior image. I do want to revisit the exterior one because I think now that I have a better and clearer idea of how to tackle it, it would be beneficial to make like a nice image of it. So I'll try to do that. And then I just did like a couple of very simple close-ups of the chartwood, because it was it's fun because this is like a redone texture, and it does look the one I had before was not chartwood, it was just like a really poorly Photoshop wood that I tried to make dark, so it was a bit problematic and different. This one is actual chartwood, so it looks better. So yeah, it's kind of sad, but because always when you have this sort of missed opportunity of dealing properly with a project that has a lot of potential, where the client is kind of open to what you're saying, but they still sort of not leave you, like you can't convince them properly to go your direction. So yeah, this is this kind of project where it's a little bit frustrating because it feels like a missed opportunity where you had like a really good project to work with. The client was kind of open to most of what you're saying, but still you don't really manage to pull off exactly what you want because you can't really identify what is wrong with your image. Here in our case, or in my case, it was this vegetation thing and the overall light that was really not the right choice, and I had to, like, it took too long for me to figure it out, unfortunately. So yeah, basically I'll stop here. I hope you've learned interesting things. I think really this lighting thing is very important to sort of grasp and to double check a lot when you're working, and to make sure also to understand what type of atmosphere leads to what type of communication. And nowadays I know that I have a much stronger understanding of this process, and it is very easy, to be honest, to explain to the client why we should have that lighting scenario instead of that one, and why, for instance, having a blue sky and a very harsh light is not necessarily bad, but it's not always necessary. And once you know exactly how to sell one scenario over the other one, you can actually exactly end up with the image you want and sort of make the client understand that this is the image they need. So hopefully by addressing this sort of like overcast weather and how it can actually help in conveying some specific aspect of a project, I managed to sort of let you learn some stuff in this video. So that'll be it, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers guys, bye.